The fastest way to lose the respect that comes with a badge is to believe that prejudice is the same thing as good judgment. On a cool autumn evening in Georgetown, Washington, District of Columbia, elegant lights spilled from the windows of one of the city's most respected restaurants, casting a warm glow across the brick sidewalks as guests arrived in tailored suits, evening dresses, and business attire. Valets greeted luxury sedans and sport utility vehicles, while quiet conversations blended with the distant sounds of traffic rolling through the historic neighborhood. Inside the restaurant, polished crystal reflected the soft golden light of hanging chandeliers, creating an atmosphere reserved for diplomats, attorneys, judges, and business leaders gathering after another demanding day in the nation's capital. Just outside the entrance, Officer Daniel Foster adjusted the body camera attached to the front of his uniform before scanning the arriving guests. The restaurant had hired several off-duty police officers to provide security during a legal conference being held nearby, and Daniel viewed the assignment as an opportunity to demonstrate vigilance. Earlier that afternoon, restaurant management had reminded the security team to monitor the entrance carefully because several high-profile government officials were expected throughout the evening. Daniel interpreted those instructions through the confidence built by years of patrol work, believing he could recognize who belonged and who did not within seconds of seeing them. A black luxury sedan quietly stopped along the curb before pulling away after dropping off a single passenger. An African-American woman stepped onto the sidewalk wearing an elegant navy business suit beneath a tailored overcoat, carrying only a slim leather portfolio and a small handbag. Her silver-streaked natural curls framed a calm, thoughtful face marked more by quiet confidence than outward authority. She paused for a brief moment to admire the historic architecture surrounding the restaurant before walking steadily toward the entrance. Her name was Justice Evelyn Carter, though no one standing outside recognized her yet. Earlier that day, she had concluded a series of judicial meetings and accepted an invitation to dinner with several distinguished legal scholars visiting from across the country. The reservation had been arranged weeks in advance, and colleagues already waited inside. As she approached the front entrance, Daniel watched her carefully from several yards away. Without realizing it, he had already begun building a story in his mind long before speaking a single word. He noticed the simple elegance of her clothing, but convinced himself it appeared out of place among the more formally dressed guests entering moments earlier. He saw her carrying only a portfolio and quietly wondered why someone attending such a gathering would arrive alone. Every ordinary detail gradually became another reason supporting an assumption he had already accepted. Justice Carter reached the entrance with the same calm dignity that had accompanied her throughout decades of public service. She smiled politely toward the hostess visible through the glass doors, preparing to step inside, when Daniel moved forward and quietly blocked her path. The conversations nearby softened almost immediately as several arriving guests noticed the unexpected exchange unfolding beneath the restaurant's glowing entrance lights. Justice Carter looked at the officer with patient curiosity rather than surprise, her posture relaxed and her expression composed. Daniel stood firmly between her and the doorway, convinced he was protecting the establishment from someone who did not belong there. Neither of them realized that before the evening ended, the crowded restaurant behind those polished glass doors would witness a lesson about dignity, authority, and the extraordinary difference between judging appearances and discovering the truth. The cool evening air carried the faint aroma of autumn leaves and freshly prepared meals as guests continued arriving beneath the elegant entrance canopy. Officer Daniel Foster remained standing between Justice Evelyn Carter and the restaurant doors, his posture firm and his expression shaped by quiet certainty rather than curiosity. Behind the glass entrance, the hostess noticed the unexpected pause and glanced toward the manager before returning to greet newly arriving diners. Soft piano music drifted from inside while crystal chandeliers cast warm reflections across polished marble floors, creating a striking contrast to the growing tension outside. Justice Carter remained composed, her leather portfolio resting comfortably at her side, her eyes meeting the officers without anger or fear. Daniel spoke first. "Good evening, ma'am. Before you enter, I need to ask whether you have a reservation." His voice remained professional, but the conclusion behind the question had already begun forming long before he asked it. Justice Carter answered with the same calm courtesy she had carried throughout decades of public service. "Yes, officer. My colleagues are expecting me." Daniel nodded briefly. "May I have the name on the reservation?" She smiled politely. "Carter." Daniel looked toward the hostess through the glass entrance, then back toward Justice Carter without inviting her inside. "Please wait here while we verify that." Justice Carter acknowledged the request with a gentle nod. Of course. She neither argued nor questioned his authority. Instead, she quietly stepped aside, allowing other arriving guests to enter as the evening continued around them. Several couples passed through the entrance after exchanging brief, curious glances toward the scene unfolding beside the doorway. A valet carrying a guest's keys slowed for only a moment before continuing his work. The restaurant remained alive with conversation, laughter, and the gentle clinking of dinner glasses, unaware that the quiet exchange outside would soon become the only subject anyone remembered from that evening. Daniel approached the hostess inside the entrance and quietly asked her to search the reservation list. She scanned the electronic tablet carefully before looking back at him. "I cannot find Carter," she replied softly. Daniel folded his arms with growing confidence. "That is what I expected." Neither of them realized that the reservation had been placed weeks earlier under the conference organizer's name, rather than the individual guests attending the private dinner. Daniel stepped outside again and addressed Justice Carter. "I do not see a reservation under your name." Justice Carter listened without changing her expression. "The reservation may be under the event organizer." Daniel shook his head gently. "Until we verify that, I cannot allow you inside." She answered quietly. "I understand." The simplicity of her response surprised him. He had expected frustration or insistence, yet she displayed neither. Instead, her attention drifted briefly toward the discreet security camera mounted above the restaurant entrance before returning to Daniel. She noticed his body camera recording every conversation. She observed his nameplate polished neatly above his badge. Finally, she glanced toward the elegant antique clock mounted inside the lobby beyond the glass doors. Every small detail settled quietly into her memory. Nearby, the restaurant manager received a phone call and excused himself toward a quieter corner of the lobby. His expression changed almost immediately as he listened. Outside, another black government sedan turned slowly onto the narrow Georgetown street several blocks away. Justice Carter noticed it only for a moment before calmly returning her attention to the officer standing before her. Daniel remained convinced he was preventing an unauthorized guest from entering a private event, while the truth continued making its way toward the restaurant one steady mile at a time. The minutes passed quietly beneath the warm glow of the restaurant entrance as Georgetown continued its elegant evening routine. Luxury vehicles stopped briefly along the curb, well-dressed guests exchanged cheerful greetings, and the soft sound of live piano music drifted through the glass doors each time another party entered the dining room. Justice Evelyn Carter remained exactly where she had been asked to wait, standing calmly beside a large stone planter decorated with autumn flowers. She rested both hands lightly on the leather portfolio she carried, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, and her expression unchanged. To anyone watching from across the street, she appeared less like someone being questioned and more like someone patiently waiting for the evening to continue. Officer Daniel Foster interpreted that composure differently. In his mind, unusual calm suggested someone attempting to appear confident while avoiding unwanted attention. Every passing second strengthened a conclusion he had already accepted before the conversation even began. He glanced once more toward the hostess inside the restaurant, who shook her head gently after checking the reservation list again. Daniel walked back toward Justice Carter with measured confidence. "I still cannot locate your reservation," he explained. "Without confirmation, I cannot allow you to enter the private event." Justice Carter acknowledged his words with a small nod. Perhaps the reservation was made under the conference organization rather than an individual guest. Daniel folded his arms. "The manager is checking, but until then I need you to remain outside." She answered quietly, "That will be fine." Her willingness to cooperate seemed to unsettle him more than disagreement would have. She neither demanded special treatment nor attempted to persuade him. Instead, she simply looked briefly toward the security camera mounted above the entrance before returning her attention to the officer. She noticed the polished brass nameplate displaying Daniel Foster above his badge. She noticed the small red indicator showing that his body camera continued recording. She noticed the antique clock inside the lobby now approaching 7 o'clock. Every detail settled silently into her memory without comment. Inside the restaurant, the manager ended his phone conversation with an expression that had noticeably changed from confidence to concern. He hurried toward the reservation desk and quietly asked the hostess another question before opening the digital reservation system himself. His fingers moved quickly across the screen as he searched under several different names instead of only one. At that same moment, several diners seated near the front windows began noticing the growing delay outside. Quiet conversations softened as curious glances drifted toward the entrance. No one understood exactly what had happened, but many sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Across the narrow Georgetown street, two black government sedans turned slowly around the corner and continued toward the restaurant with disciplined spacing. Their headlights reflected softly across the historic brick buildings as they approached without flashing lights or unnecessary attention. Justice Carter noticed the vehicles immediately but offered no reaction. Daniel followed her brief glance toward the street before dismissing it as ordinary evening traffic. His attention remained fixed on the woman standing before him, still convinced he was preventing an unauthorized guest from entering a private gathering. The manager suddenly looked up from the reservation screen, his eyes widening as if he had finally discovered something important. Without saying a word, he hurried toward the front entrance just as the first government sedan quietly stopped beside the curb, bringing with it the truth that had been traveling steadily toward the restaurant while assumptions had arrived there long before. The first government sedan came to a smooth stop beside the restaurant entrance, followed only seconds later by a second identical vehicle that settled quietly behind it. There were no flashing lights, no loud commands, and no unnecessary attention. Instead, the atmosphere changed through quiet precision alone. Well-dressed guests standing near the entrance instinctively stepped aside as two professionally dressed United States Marshals exited the lead vehicle with calm confidence. Their dark suits blended almost seamlessly with the elegant evening crowd, yet their disciplined movements immediately distinguished them from everyone else nearby. Officer Daniel Foster watched the unexpected arrival with growing curiosity. He assumed the officials were attending the same legal conference being held inside the restaurant, but he never imagined they had come because of the woman still waiting patiently only a few feet away. The restaurant manager hurried through the glass entrance carrying a tablet in one hand and an expression of unmistakable concern on his face. "Officer Foster," he began quietly, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding tonight's reservation." Daniel looked toward him. "The reservation list does not include Carter." The manager nodded quickly. "That is because the private dining room was reserved under the National Judicial Conference, not under the names of the individual guests." Before Daniel could respond, the senior United States Marshal walked directly past him with respectful confidence. He approached Justice Evelyn Carter, stopped only a few feet away, and offered a warm smile that reflected genuine professional respect. "Good evening, Justice Carter," he said. "We apologize for the unexpected delay. Everyone inside has been waiting for your arrival." The words settled over the entrance with remarkable silence. Conversations near the doorway stopped almost immediately. Guests who had been entering the restaurant paused in place. Even the valet standing near the curb quietly lowered his hand, watching the exchange unfold beneath the soft golden lights. Justice Carter returned the marshal's greeting with the same calm grace she had maintained since arriving. "Good evening," she replied. "Thank you for coming." One of the marshals accepted her leather portfolio while another briefly confirmed the evening schedule before stepping respectfully aside. Daniel remained motionless, trying to understand what he had just heard. He looked from the marshals to Justice Carter and then toward the restaurant manager, whose expression now reflected equal parts embarrassment and urgency. The manager spoke carefully. "Officer Foster, Justice Carter is the guest of honor for tonight's judicial dinner." Daniel's confident posture began to soften, yet the full reality still had not reached him. The senior marshal reached inside his jacket and presented official credentials with quiet professionalism. The polished identification displayed the seal of the Supreme Court Police Detail assigned to judicial protection. Daniel examined the credentials carefully before returning them with noticeably steadier hands than he expected. The marshal offered a polite nod. Justice Carter has been serving at the highest level of our nation's judiciary for many years. We appreciate your commitment to security, officer, but she has been expected here all evening. Daniel slowly looked back toward Justice Carter. Throughout the entire encounter, she had never raised her voice, never argued, never demanded recognition, and never attempted to use her position to change the conversation. She had simply waited with remarkable patience while everyone else caught up to the truth. Above the entrance, the small security camera continued recording every moment beneath the warm restaurant lights as the antique clock inside the lobby quietly struck 7, marking the exact moment when assumptions finally stepped aside and reality walked through the front door. For several quiet seconds, no one moved. The warm glow from the restaurant windows spilled across the brick sidewalk as conversations inside faded into an uneasy silence. Guests standing near the entrance looked from Justice Evelyn Carter to Officer Daniel Foster, sensing that something far more significant than an ordinary misunderstanding had just unfolded. The restaurant manager took a slow breath before stepping toward Justice Carter with sincere regret. "Justice Carter," he said respectfully, "please accept my deepest apologies for this unfortunate delay. We have been preparing for your arrival all evening." Justice Carter answered with the same composed grace that had defined every moment since she first stepped onto the sidewalk. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I appreciate your kindness." Her calm response surprised several people standing nearby. There was no frustration in her voice, no demand for recognition, and no attempt to embarrass anyone. The senior United States Marshal looked toward Officer Daniel Foster with professional courtesy before speaking. "Officer, we recognize the responsibility that comes with protecting a public venue. Security requires careful judgment." Daniel nodded quietly, grateful for the respectful tone. Before he could answer, the marshal continued. "That judgment must always begin with complete information." The words settled over the entrance with quiet weight. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly as he replayed the evening in his mind. He realized that long before asking questions, he had already reached conclusions. Long before verifying reservations, he had already decided who belonged and who did not. Justice Carter accepted her leather portfolio from one of the marshals before turning toward Daniel. She looked directly into his eyes, not with disappointment, but with remarkable patience. "Officer Foster," she said gently, "every person who approaches a doorway carries a story that cannot be seen from the sidewalk." Daniel listened without interrupting. "The responsibility of public service," she continued, "is remembering that dignity should never depend on whether someone is recognized." Those words remained in the quiet evening air long after she finished speaking. The restaurant manager personally opened the entrance doors, inviting Justice Carter and the judicial delegation inside. As they entered the private dining room, every guest already waiting rose respectfully to welcome her arrival. Distinguished judges, professors, legal scholars, and public servants greeted her warmly, not because of her title alone, but because of the respect she had earned through decades of service. Outside, Daniel remained standing beneath the entrance canopy while the United States Marshals prepared to return to their vehicles. One of them paused briefly beside him. "Body cameras record conversations," the marshal said calmly. "Character is recorded somewhere much harder to erase." Daniel watched as the marshal walked away without another word. The statement stayed with him long after the government vehicles quietly departed into the Georgetown evening. Inside the restaurant, the dinner began exactly as planned. Conversations focused on constitutional law, public trust, and the enduring importance of an independent judiciary. Justice Carter participated with her usual wisdom and humility, never mentioning the misunderstanding that had delayed her arrival. She had no interest in allowing one uncomfortable moment to overshadow an evening dedicated to justice itself. Outside, the restaurant entrance gradually returned to its ordinary rhythm as new guests arrived and departed beneath the soft autumn lights. Yet for Officer Daniel Foster, nothing about the evening felt ordinary anymore. Standing quietly beside the same doorway he had guarded with such confidence only an hour earlier, he finally understood that authority is never measured by the power to stop someone from entering a room. It is measured by the wisdom to make certain the right person is never kept waiting outside it. The dinner concluded late that evening beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers as distinguished judges, legal scholars, and public officials quietly exchanged final conversations before departing into the cool Georgetown night. Justice Evelyn Carter stepped outside accompanied by 2 United States Marshals, who remained respectfully nearby without interrupting her conversations with several colleagues. The historic streets had grown quieter, their brick sidewalks reflecting soft pools of light cast by antique street lamps, while the distant sound of evening traffic drifted gently through the neighborhood. The restaurant manager personally thanked every guest before turning once more toward Justice Carter. "Your Honor," he said sincerely, "we are grateful for your understanding this evening." Justice Carter smiled warmly. Respect grows strongest when people are willing to learn. Those simple words lingered long after the conversation ended. Across the entrance, Officer Daniel Foster quietly completed the final notes required for his security assignment before returning to his patrol vehicle. The confidence that had carried him through the beginning of the evening had been replaced by thoughtful reflection. Instead of driving away immediately, he remained seated inside the cruiser reviewing the body camera recording from the moment Justice Carter first approached the entrance. He watched every minute without interruption. He noticed details he had overlooked in real time. She had answered every question politely. She had never attempted to bypass procedure. She had never mentioned her position, demanded recognition, or spoken with anger. She had simply waited with extraordinary patience while everyone else caught up to the truth. The recording ended, leaving only the quiet hum of the patrol vehicle's engine beneath the autumn sky. Daniel remained still for several moments before switching off the monitor. He understood that the greatest lesson recorded by the camera had nothing to do with legal procedure. It revealed how quickly assumptions could replace careful observation when confidence moved faster than evidence. Before leaving the parking area, Daniel completed an incident memorandum describing the evening exactly as it had occurred, documenting every conversation without minimizing his own decisions. He submitted the report through the department's standard internal review process because accountability, he now realized, carried meaning only when applied consistently. Early the following morning, the first light of sunrise spread across the city skyline as department supervisors began reviewing reports from the previous evening. Alongside Daniel's written memorandum, they examined the restaurant security recording and the body camera footage, comparing each event carefully with department policies governing professional conduct during off-duty security assignments. The review focused not on punishment alone but on whether professional standards had been fully upheld. Shortly after sunrise, Daniel was asked to report to his commanding lieutenant before beginning his regular shift. The meeting remained respectful and straightforward. After reviewing the documented facts, the lieutenant informed him that his law enforcement authority would be temporarily suspended while the department completed its formal administrative review in accordance with established policy. Daniel listened quietly, offering no excuses and placing his badge on the desk without argument. He understood that accountability begins the moment a public servant accepts responsibility for personal decisions. As morning sunlight filled the office window behind him, he looked once toward the polished badge resting on the lieutenant's desk before quietly standing to leave. Outside, another ordinary workday had already begun across Washington, District of Columbia. People hurried toward offices, courthouses, restaurants, and schools without knowing that one quiet misunderstanding from the previous evening had already become a lesson reaching far beyond a single doorway. Because true justice is never measured by how quickly authority is exercised. It is measured by the humility to recognize when authority must first answer to the truth. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet dignity that no newspaper headline could fully capture. Inside the police department, the administrative review continued according to established procedures, guided by documented evidence rather than public opinion. Supervisors carefully examined the restaurant security recordings, the body camera footage, witness statements, and Officer Daniel Foster's own written memorandum. Every fact was reviewed in the same deliberate manner expected of any professional inquiry. Daniel attended each meeting with a noticeably different perspective than the one he had carried on the evening outside the restaurant. He answered every question honestly, accepted responsibility for his decisions, and never attempted to shift blame onto the reservation system, the restaurant staff, or anyone else involved. The experience had become something larger than a single mistake. It had become a lesson about how quickly certainty could replace curiosity when assumptions were allowed to speak before evidence. Several days later, the department's professional standards unit introduced a new training session for both experienced officers and recent academy graduates. Rather than focusing only on legal procedures, the presentation emphasized communication, verification, unconscious assumptions, and the importance of treating every member of the public with equal professionalism regardless of appearance or circumstance. Daniel requested permission to attend the session, not as an instructor but as a participant. Sitting quietly among younger officers, he listened as the training supervisor explained that public trust is built one encounter at a time. Every traffic stop, every conversation, every question asked in a respectful manner either strengthens confidence in the justice system or quietly weakens it. Daniel recognized every lesson because he had lived through one unforgettable example himself. Across the city, Justice Evelyn Carter continued her judicial responsibilities with the same steady discipline that had defined her career for decades. Cases arrived before the court one after another, each requiring careful attention, thoughtful deliberation, and unwavering commitment to the Constitution. She never spoke publicly about the restaurant incident. She did not seek interviews, statements, or recognition. To her, the most meaningful outcome had never been personal acknowledgement. It was knowing that one difficult evening had encouraged honest reflection inside a law enforcement agency responsible for serving thousands of people every year. During a judicial education symposium later that month, a young law clerk asked Justice Carter what quality she believed mattered most in public service. She smiled gently before answering. Humility, the willingness to admit that we do not know everything the moment we first see someone. Those simple words stayed with everyone in the room long after the session ended. Back at the department, Daniel completed the final requirements assigned during the administrative review process. Before leaving the building one evening, he paused beside the department's framed code of ethics displayed near the front lobby. He had walked past those words countless times throughout his career without stopping. This time he read every sentence carefully. Integrity, fairness, respect, accountability. They no longer sounded like abstract ideals printed on a wall. They sounded like responsibilities that had to be earned every single day. As evening settled across Washington, the city lights slowly reflected against courthouse windows, police stations, and quiet neighborhood streets alike. Thousands of strangers continued crossing paths without knowing each other's names, professions, or stories. Yet somewhere beneath those same lights, one officer had learned that authority is strongest when guided by humility, and one justice had quietly demonstrated that true dignity never needs to announce itself because character always speaks long before titles ever do. Several months later, the Department of Justice and the Metropolitan Police Department jointly hosted a professional leadership forum in Washington, District of Columbia, bringing together judges, prosecutors, police supervisors, legal scholars, and public servants from across the region. The purpose of the gathering was not to celebrate individual achievements, but to strengthen cooperation between institutions that served the same public through different responsibilities. Inside the conference hall, rows of officers sat beside assistant prosecutors, federal attorneys, court administrators, and judicial staff while quiet conversations filled the room before the opening session began. Officer Daniel Foster entered with several members of his department, taking a seat toward the middle of the auditorium rather than near the front. Months earlier, he would have walked into the room believing experience alone answered every question. Now he arrived carrying a notebook, determined to leave with more understanding than he had brought. A few minutes later, Justice Evelyn Carter entered through a side doorway accompanied only by a court administrator. There was no announcement, no dramatic introduction, and no special attention requested on her behalf. Several people stood respectfully as she quietly greeted colleagues before taking her place among the speakers. When the program began, the moderator invited Justice Carter to discuss the relationship between public confidence and the rule of law. She stepped to the podium with the same calm presence that had defined every moment since the evening outside the restaurant. "Every institution represented in this room exists for one reason," she began. "To serve people with fairness before expecting their trust." The audience listened in complete silence. She spoke about patience, careful judgment, and the responsibility carried by everyone who exercised public authority, reminding the audience that dignity should never depend upon recognition, occupation, appearance, or social status. She never mentioned the restaurant, the misunderstanding, or Officer Foster. Instead, she spoke about principles large enough to include everyone listening. Daniel quietly wrote notes throughout the presentation, recognizing how many of her observations connected directly to lessons he had learned through difficult experience. After the session ended, the moderator invited questions from younger officers and recent law school graduates. One young police recruit stood and asked what the most important quality in public service should be. Justice Carter smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Curiosity before certainty. Ask one more question before deciding you already know the answer." The room remained silent for several seconds before warm applause spread naturally across the audience. Following the morning presentations, attendees gathered in the conference lobby for coffee and conversation. Daniel noticed Justice Carter speaking with several judges and attorneys before politely waiting until their discussion concluded. When she turned toward him, he offered a respectful handshake. "Thank you for today's presentation, Justice Carter," he said sincerely. "I have carried your earlier words with me every day since we first met." She returned the handshake with a warm smile. "Then something good came from an evening that neither of us expected." Daniel nodded quietly. "It changed how I serve every person I meet." Justice Carter looked toward the officers and legal professionals continuing their conversations throughout the lobby. "That is how public trust grows," she replied. "Not through perfection, but through people who choose to become better after learning something difficult." Around them, the conference continued with thoughtful discussion, shared ideas, and renewed partnerships between agencies that understood justice was strongest when every profession respected both the law and the people it existed to protect. As sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the nation's capital, the lesson that had begun at a single restaurant entrance continued spreading quietly through every conversation held that day. 1 year later, another autumn evening settled gently over Washington, District of Columbia, painting the marble columns of the Supreme Court in warm shades of gold, as citizens hurried home beneath clear skies and quiet streets. Time had carried both Justice Evelyn Carter and Officer Daniel Foster far beyond the evening that had unexpectedly connected their lives. Yet the lesson from that restaurant doorway continued shaping countless decisions made by people who had never even been there. At the police department, newly assigned officers often heard Daniel repeat the same principle before beginning patrol. "Every person deserves the same respect before you know who they are as they deserve after you discover their title." Those words gradually became part of the department's daily culture, passed from field training officers to academy graduates, transforming one difficult experience into something that strengthened the profession instead of weakening it. Across the city, Justice Carter continued serving the nation with the same quiet dignity that had defined every chapter of her career. Court opinions were written, constitutional questions carefully examined, and countless lives influenced by decisions reached through patience, discipline, and unwavering commitment to fairness. She never spoke publicly about the evening outside the restaurant because she believed that lasting change grows through reflection rather than humiliation. One Saturday afternoon, a community outreach event brought judges, police officers, attorneys, teachers, and local families together in a public square near the National Mall. Children explored educational exhibits while officers answered questions about public safety, legal professionals discussed civic responsibility, and volunteers encouraged young students to consider careers dedicated to public service. Daniel greeted visitors with genuine warmth, taking time to answer every question with patience that had become second nature over the past year. Nearby, Justice Carter visited with students interested in constitutional law, encouraging them to believe that integrity always matters more than recognition. As the afternoon continued, their paths crossed once again beneath rows of American flags moving gently in the breeze. Daniel smiled respectfully before extending his hand. "It is good to see you again, Justice Carter." She returned the handshake with quiet kindness. "It is good to see you too, Officer Foster." There was no awkwardness between them, only mutual respect earned through honesty, accountability, and growth. Daniel looked toward the families enjoying the event before speaking softly. "That evening changed the way I see every person I meet." Justice Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Then it accomplished something worthwhile." She paused briefly before adding, "Justice does not begin inside a courtroom. It begins with ordinary choices made by ordinary people long before anyone notices." Daniel quietly reflected on her words as children laughed nearby and neighbors continued speaking comfortably with officers, attorneys, and judges gathered throughout the square. The afternoon slowly gave way to evening as golden sunlight faded behind the monuments of the nation's capital, leaving the city wrapped in the peaceful glow of another ordinary day. Before walking towards separate responsibilities once again, Justice Carter offered one final thought that remained with everyone fortunate enough to hear it. "A title may explain what someone does, but character reveals who someone truly is." Daniel watched her disappear into the crowd with deep appreciation for a lesson that had reshaped not only his own career, but also the way countless others within his department approached the people they had sworn to serve. Because authority may open doors, experience may build confidence, and recognition may earn admiration. But only humility, fairness, and truth have the power to create justice that lasts long after every badge, every title, and every first impression have faded into memory.